the Redeemer. But that's what I want to talk about today. God being a Redeemer. God is faithful to his promises. And I want to preach on that today. And if you can with me, let's go to the book of Exodus. Exodus. And what I'm going to talk about today is something called covenant theology. Covenant theology. That's a basic intro into it. And to understand covenant theology, you have to go to the Old Testament. Because that's where God first makes his covenants. But I want you to understand this reality of who God is in relation to his people. And how he is a redeemer to his people. So let's go to Exodus now. A background, you guys know the story of Exodus. You know, God makes a promise to Abraham that Israel would be a great nation. And through Israel would come the Messiah. He made that promise to Abraham. He said, Abraham, you have to believe this. You see in Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12, I believe, is the greatest chapter in all of the Bible, where God speaks to Abraham. And according to Paul, in Galatians chapter 3, verse 8, God is preaching the gospel to Abraham. And what does God tell Abraham? Like I said, he told him, I want to bless you, and you will have descendants as numerous as the stars, and many nations will be blessed through your descendants. And like I said, Paul said this is the gospel, that Jesus is to come through Israel to redeem his people. This is why when Jesus comes on the scene in Matthew chapter 1, verse 23, I believe it says, you shall call his name Jesus, when Gabriel is speaking to Mary, and he says he shall save his people from their sins. He's accomplishing this Abrahamic covenant. But then down the line we see that the people of Israel, because Joseph brought his dad and his brothers to Israel, they prospered for a time. They did good in Egypt because Joseph was second in command in Egypt. But after Joseph had died, some years had passed and a new Pharaoh came into power. We know the story, and they got enslaved because the Pharaoh was like, these people are strong. These are God's people now, right? These people are strong. One day they can come and overpower us. So let's make them work. Let's make them work hard. And God in his providence, even though the Pharaoh worked them hard, they began to be more strong. They began to be more stronger. And you know what? Pharaoh was like, you know what? Take every baby and kill them. Every male. As soon as they're born, you take them and you kill them, because these people are too much. And one day they'll try to overpower us. So the people of Israel, though God made a promise, I want you to understand that, though God made a promise for this people, they had to go through all these years of slavery, all these years of pain, and all these years of suffering, but they are God's people, right? So we see in Exodus chapter 2, let's read. Exodus chapter 2, verse 23, it says, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came to God. Verse 24, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. So these people are in slavery, and they cried out to God. Because the word of the Lord says in Psalm chapter 4 that God hears the cries or the prayers of his people, of his saints. Yes. His people cried out to him. They are the chosen race. Exodus chapter 19 goes on to talk about how these people, God has chosen them to be his vessel to, like he said in Genesis 12, to bless the nations. We are all here blessed because of Israel, because Jesus came through Israel and blessed us through his redeeming work. But he made this promise with Abraham, as I said, and they cried out to God, and he heard their cry. And why was he about to act? Why is he about to redeem them? What did it say? He remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. Because these are the covenant people of God. When we talk about covenant, we're talking about what that means is a promise made between two parties. That's what we talk about in the basics, in the intro to covenant theology. It's God making a promise to his creature. We see the first covenant in the book of Genesis, like I said. That's what covenant is. And he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. In verse 25 says, God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Now let's read chapter 3. Let's go to chapter 3. You have to understand this. This is the second greatest chapter in the Bible, in my opinion. Genesis 12 and then Exodus chapter 3. It's a beautiful chapter, and we grew up listening to it and hearing it in Sunday school, but they taught us it differently. They taught us it in a way to emphasize the miracle of the burning bush. And that is a miracle. It's a bush, right? And it's not burning up. Even though it's on fire, it wasn't burning up. That's a miracle in and of itself. That denies the laws of physics. But that's not the main thing that we should see in Exodus chapter 3, that we should learn from Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3 is so beautiful. Let's read it. Bear with me. Let's read the chapter. It says, Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I've heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. Verse 9, And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Verse 12, he said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, this is very important. This is like the best chapter, best verse I've ever read in my life. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to Moses, What is his name? What shall I say to them? Verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am.
Amen, amen. Glad you.
And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent you. God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever.
I am.
And thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Verse 16, And go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, The Lord, You see when you read that in the Bible, it has a capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. So as I said, we see these people who are in slavery, and Moses, we know his story. He ends up killing an Egyptian because the Egyptian was beating his fellow brethren, his fellow Hebrew. So he left and ran away from Egypt into the wilderness, and he comes across these people, these Midianites, and he marries the leader's daughter, Jethro. He marries them, and he becomes a shepherd, keeping the sheep. And as he's shepherding the flock, he comes one day and he sees this burning bush and says, you know what, let me go see what's going on with this bush. It's on fire, but it's not burning. And then God spoke to him. And God told him his plan for the people of Israel. He said, I'm going to deliver this people because I have made a promise with Abraham. I have made a promise with Isaac. I have made a promise with Jacob. And Moses responds in this way of unbelief. He says, how can I do this? But God is reminding him. You see in this chapter, he keeps on saying, I am the God of your fathers. He's trying to say, Moses, you don't understand. What I'm going to do comes before you. This promise that I've had, this has come before you. I have promised Abraham a land flowing with milk and honey. This is something that's beyond you. This is bigger than you, Moses. I have promised my people this land flowing with milk and honey. And then Moses asks him, God, because in the pagan world at that time, every god has a name. There was Baal. There was Belial. There was all these gods. They have a name. And he told them, if they ask me, who is this God that sends you? What am I to say to that? And he gives them this answer. It's I am who I am. Now we look at this transliteration, how it's translated into these four letters. YHWH. And in the English transliteration and translation, we say Yahweh. And when he asked him, what is my name? What is the name that I should tell them? My name is Yahweh. And what this name established, he says, I am who I am. What this name establishes is this word called God's aseity. What that means is God is self-existent. That God doesn't need no one to exist. We depend on God to exist. As a baby, I depend on my mother to feed me to exist. I am a dependent creature. We are all here dependent on something, someone, and primarily God. As Paul says in Acts chapter 17, in him I live, in him I move, and in him do I have my being. That means I exist only because God exists. I exist because of God. I am dependent upon God. But when God says, I am who I am, when he says, I am Yahweh, what that is establishing is the reality that he is not a dependent creature. He exists in of himself. And the only thing that he needs to exist is himself. He is not dependent. He is not a creature. And the context of which God is speaking to Moses is, I'm going to deliver these people. I am going to take them out of Egypt. But when God tells Moses his name, which I said is he only needs himself to exist, that he is unchanging, and that he is God of the universe, what he's saying right there, what he's telling Moses is, you can trust me because I don't need any of you guys. You can trust me because I'm self-existent. You can trust me because I'm unchanging. I will bring about this promise, I am who I am Yahweh. And like I said, in the context of this, what he's establishing when he tells Moses his name, Yahweh, is that he's a covenant keeper. He's making a covenant with Moses. And he's establishing the reality that he is a covenant keeper. When we talk about Yahweh, when we sing, this is why whenever we sing, You Are Yahweh, you guys see me get crazy. I don't get crazy for no reason. Because I'm listening to the words and I know what it means to call God Yahweh. That means he is a covenant keeping God. Yahweh, I am who I am. I will redeem my covenant people. I will redeem my covenant people. And it's so hard. And if you see in the story as you read Exodus, it became so hard for the people to believe this. As Moses goes to Egypt, he says to Pharaoh, let my people go. And instead of letting the people go, what he does is he doubles the workload. He doubles the workload on the people of Israel. He makes them work even harder, all because Moses came to Egypt and said, let my people go. So you can imagine how hard it was for the people of Israel, God's covenant people, to believe the promise that Abraham was telling them that they're going to be delivered. And I want to tell you today, it can be really hard because we are now God's covenant people. You know, like I said in Exodus chapter 19, he talks to Israel and he tells them that you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a people for my own possession. That's Exodus chapter 4 and 19 quotes it. That's Old Testament. He's talking to Israel. But we see in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, now this is New Testament. He's talking to the new covenant people. He says, you are a chosen race. You are a royal priesthood. We are now God's covenant people. We don't replace ethnic Israel, but we are a fruition of ethnic Israel. We are Jews. Paul says in Galatians, who is a true Jew? One of faith is a true Jew. One of faith is a true Jew. Those of faith are part of the people of God. And the same way that God made a promise to his people to lead them to a land flowing with milk and honey through everything that they were going through is the same way that God promises his new covenant people to lead them to a land flowing with milk and honey through the turmoil and the persecution that we may go through as the church. And understand that in America we're so privileged, but we have Christians in Afghanistan waiting to die. And they could live if they wanted to. All they have to do is deny Jesus. But they're not doing it, JR. We have to fight to get people to church. But there's people in Afghanistan losing their lives just for being a Christian, nothing else. They're going door to door, checking the phones of the people, seeing if they have the Bible app. And if you have the Bible app, you're going to die. Wow. Do you understand that? We're so focused on this Western world, and American evangelicals think that this is the epicenter of the world, that everything revolves around America. But that's not the only place in America. I mean, America's not the only place in the world. We got other countries, we got other places where Christians are dying for their faith. There's a statistic, and I researched this in 2018. The number surely had gone up from now, where it said 11 Christians die every single day, just for being a Christian. And sometimes people read the Bible and they're saying, implicitly, subconsciously, they're like, this prophecy is not being fulfilled because we're in America, we're living cool, we're not being persecuted. Like I said, we're not the only place in the world. Right? And all this to say, because God's covenant people in the Old Testament, before they could ever go to this land flowing with milk and honey, before they received the promise that Yahweh has given them, they went through all of this turmoil, all of this tribulation. But God assured them, through it all, I'm going to bring you home. I'm going to bring you to the place that I promised you. And I'm not saying that, and I'm not trying to say, these Christians go through so much and we don't, go through anything. I'm not saying that because we go through things as Christians in America, that we struggle with depression and anxiety, and we have turmoil and trials and tribulations in life. And that's a reality for us, but we're going to go home because Yahweh has promised that we are going to go home through everything that we go through. He's going to lead us to the promised land. And why can we believe that? Because he is who he is. He is Yahweh. He is a covenant-keeping God. He is a waymaker. He's a miracle worker. He's a promise keeper. And we have to believe that. And this is why I love to use the name Yahweh, because it indicates the reality that God is a covenant-keeping God. We can believe his promises. And he will lead us to a land flowing with milk and honey. And we see in Exodus, this is very typological. What that means is this is foreshadowing the redemption we have in Jesus Christ. Because they were going through this slavery. They were going through these moments where they were bound by their slavery. They could not be free from it because Pharaoh was too strong for them. The people of Egypt was too strong for them. And what this is typological of is because God has chosen a people before the foundation of the world. We preached about this. He has a people before the foundation of the world. And in the same way he has chosen Israel, he has chosen his people who he will save before the foundation of the world. And these people in the New Old Testament, Israel, they, like I said, were going through all these things. They were going through all these turmoils, and they were in slavery. And it signifies the reality, and it's typological of us who, before Christ, were enslaved by our sin. Jesus says in John chapter 8, whoever sins is what? A slave to sin. Romans chapter 7, when it talks about sin, and Romans chapter 8, and Galatians, when it talks about sin, and all of special revelation, all of the Bible, when it talks about sin, it speaks of sin as an oppressor. It speaks of sin as an oppressor. But not only do we have sin weighing us down, not only are we slaves to sin, but we have this other guy named Satan who tempts us. Who is leading everyone who is not in Christ. Ephesians chapter 2 says, if you are not following Christ, you're following Satan. You're following the prince of the power of the world. So we got sin weighing us down before Christ, and we have the devil who is our leader. For 2 Corinthians talks about, and it says, the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers. So the devil is working in the world. Yes. He's working, and sin is oppressing us. But what happened to all of us is what happened to the people of Israel. What happened to the new covenant people is what happened to the old covenant people. What happened is God sent a messenger. God sent Moses to go redeem the people. So he can redeem the people through Moses. He told Moses, I'm going to use you to lead the people of Israel out of this slavery into the promised land. And in Deuteronomy, Moses says something. Moses says, and he prophesies, and he says, there's going to be a prophet, and he's going to come, and he's going to be far greater than I. That's a prophecy of who? It's a prophecy of Jesus. And we see in Hebrews how in Hebrews chapter 11, in all of the book of Hebrews, it's the point the author is trying to get at is, yes, there was David as a leader. Yes, there was Moses as a leader. But Jesus comes to be the better Moses. He comes to be the better David. And in the same way that God sent Moses, who was imperfect, who made mistakes, he's sending Jesus, who is better than this guy, called Moses, to redeem his people.
Yes, Lord.
And that's what happened with us. We were in our slavery, but God redeemed us. He redeemed his people through the person and work of Jesus Christ. He brought us out of our Egypt, dead in sin, alive in Christ, as Ephesians 2 says. That's the beautiful reality of our redemption. And when we read the Old Testament, we have this tendency to be eisegetical. What that means is we put ourselves in the story and we literally remove God from the equation. Like, it's like, I'm not the hero, God is. When we talk about David and Goliath, I'm not David who's redeeming the people. It's God who's redeeming the people. It's God who redeemed me. We have a tendency to do that way too much. But we see these beautiful stories, and what they're doing is they're showing us. Because when we look in Luke chapter 24, Jesus finished resurrecting from the dead. And he's walking into this town, and these two disciples are walking as well. They didn't know it was Jesus. They didn't notice it was Jesus. Maybe we don't really know what was happening. Jesus was making sure that they wouldn't know that it was him. But as they're walking, they're sad because their Lord had died. They did not know that he resurrected. And Jesus comes up to them not knowing that it's Jesus, and he says, "Why are you guys so slow?" Basically, that's what he says. He said, "Why are you guys so foolish? Did you guys not know that this was spoken of in all of the Old Testament?" And you know what it says? It says in Luke chapter 24 that Jesus begins to speak to them about everything in the Old Testament about himself. It says he began to take him to all the prophets and the whole of the law. What is that indicating? That when we read the Old Testament, it's all about Jesus. It's all about Jesus redeeming his people. It's typology all over the place. When we see in Genesis chapter 22, God tells Abraham to sacrifice your son. This is what it says verbatim. It says, sacrifice your son, your only son. Anyone who reads Genesis and reads the Bible knows that Abraham didn't have one son. Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Why does God say, take Isaac, your only son, and sacrifice him? Because Romans 9 says that Isaac is the child of the promise. It says, through Isaac shall your people be named. Who is Isaac representing? Take your only son. What does John 3:16 say? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So what Genesis chapter 2 is doing, it's being typological. It's showing us Jesus, how Jesus is to die for his people. And Genesis chapter 22 was written 3,000 years before Jesus. Understand that. So when we read the Old Testament, going back to Exodus 3, this is signifying the redemption that God has given us through Jesus Christ. And he has purchased our redemption. He has given us our redemption. And we can be sure that he will lead us to the promised land because he is Yahweh. He is who he is. He's a covenant-keeping God. May the Lord bless you.